Good evening. My name is Rashad Byrdsong, and I'm broadcasting to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am the CEO and president of Community Empowerment Association, which is located here in Pittsburgh, which is a community-based and a community-driven organization that's been here in Pittsburgh since 1992. I'm also an associate member of the National Council for Urban Peace, Justice, and Empowerment, who have 35 affiliates throughout the country. And since 1992, we have been organizing youth summits throughout the country to address the issues of violence in our communities and the social issues that have impacts on young people of color throughout the country. Today I would like to bring to you an initiative that's been launched here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we feel this initiative in itself further continue to support mass incarceration and the criminalization of youth of color, not just here in Pittsburgh, but throughout the country. These R.I.C.O Act type initiatives have been responsible for putting thousands of young people incarcerated throughout the country. This year Pittsburgh intervention to reduce crime is almost resurrecting the Tuskegee experiment, which was launched unknowingly on African American males that induced syphilis into them just so scientists can see the impact it would have on their bodies. To me, this is another experiment that's being used here in Pittsburgh to address a deep-seated, open social wound that unfortunately the knee-jerk reactions will not cure, and unfortunately blaming this on young men of color will not cure also. Many of you here in Pittsburgh remember the work or remember the R.I.C.O Act in the early 90s, where we attempted to get young men resources, to get young men acclimated to training, to get young men involved in education. But unfortunately, once we came to the table and we talked with city officials and we talked with the foundation community and the corporate community about the social interventions that have worked, the best practice that have worked throughout the country in doing the youth prevention and intervention was not adhered to. Instead, they wanted to have a more police and law enforcement suppression program, which led to the incarceration of thousands of kids of color throughout the country. Now here we go again, 18 to 20 years after the first R.I.C.O Act here in Pittsburgh was launched against young street organizations, and now we're dealing with their brothers now. Initially, we was said that the R.I.C.O Act would solve the crime in the urban centers and in the communities of color. But yet today here in 2010, we see the R.I.C.O Act, revised again for young men. In 1992 was this young man 5, 6, 7 years old. So we see this is a cycle of continuous criminalization of young men of color. So here in Pittsburgh, just recently, over 100, close to 100 African American young men was brought to the federal courthouse. And because a lot of these young men was on probation and parole, they were made by their parole officers and probation officers to come. And there was federal prosecutors, the DA was there, probation and parole was there, and all of these people was there to tell these young men that if you don't go straight, you will go to jail, and any association of you will go to jail also. Our concern with this broad brush approach in addressing youth crime in our community, it straddles on constitutional right and human right violations that unfortunately historically we have seen in our community for years. So we got to ask ourselves, did these individuals willingly attend this scared straight call-in session? Were their human rights violated? Did they have any representation? Does Pittsburgh even represent the cities that the Pittsburgh intervention to reduce crime was so-called successful in? Chicago, San Francisco, and Cincinnati. Now, this program was introduced to Pittsburgh by David Kennedy, which is a PhD and a consultant that's been known to be involved in various conservative think tanks that supposedly came out of Boston around the Boston Miracle. So he's been going throughout the country peddling this here model of suppression throughout the country that have led to the incarceration, the mass incarceration, and I'm sure constitution violations, of young people of color. Unfortunately, this knee-jerk reaction has not led to any changes in our community at all. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is the R.I.C.O involved or any type of human rights commissions involved on board monitoring these processes that's going on throughout the country? Why isn't more service providers involved? Supposedly, when David Kennedy presented this year program, he said it wasn't only a suppression program, but also it was a program that will address young people getting jobs in training and assistance in school attainment. However, here in Pittsburgh, and I'm sure throughout the country, there's various type of disparities that continue to be perpetuated in our city. And one of them, of course, is the level of incarceration of young men of color, the increased rate of dropout. Here in Pittsburgh, close to 50% of young people are dropping out of school. The unemployment is double digits, and many of these young people don't have any type of training at all. So you would think that part of this program will have a very strong social service in also. Now let's rewind the tape a little bit to give you a better understanding how this program came about here in Pittsburgh. In September 2008, the program was proposed because we, like many other cities, I'm sure, have been experiencing an increased rate of violence in our community. And various meetings was held throughout the community to address the whole issue of crime and violence, and we can go on and on and on and on. Rather than taking these suggestions from many of us that said we need to probably have a public health approach, and in using the public health approach from an epidemiology perspective, we began to look at the variables and the root causes and the demographics of where certain things happen at. But rather than to go through and developing a long-term, comprehensive, holistic approach to addressing this issue, the city decided to use David Kennedy's approach to addressing violence in our community. In April 2010, the lack of project activity. In other words, they sent the project to the city auditor. And the city audit saw that there wasn't a lot of activities going on with this here program, even though the city have allocated $200,000 for this initiative, which could have went towards some of the best practices that's already occurring here in Pittsburgh with a lot of grassroots, on-the-ground organizations that's doing now. In 2010, they announced the program set to begin, and in 2010, they convened over 60 African-American young men at our county federal courthouse. This initiative model should have involved the entire community. The call-in session is supposed to include so-called gang members, and again, we have to question what constitutes a gang here in the city and throughout the country. Do a gang mean that you're a young person of color and you live in a diverse community? Do it mean that you're a gang member if you look a certain way, if you wear certain clothes, or do you listen to certain music? Because we know also, in addition, what has been happening to young men of color is racial profiling. In the haste to begin this initiative, the program failed to demonstrate any type of program practices. The city of Pittsburgh must reevaluate the makeup and the dynamics of their communities here in Pittsburgh